When Karen Winters decides to call the cops on her new neighbor for sunbathing in her own backyard, she has no idea she's just declared war on the most powerful law enforcement official in the city. FBI Director Alexandra Ramirez isn't just going to take this lying down. Karen Winters, a 48-year-old uptight woman who serves as the chairperson of the local HOA, is peering through her blinds with binoculars, spying on her new neighbor's backyard. Her husband Dave, 50 and noticeably more easygoing, sits on the couch reading a newspaper, barely paying attention to his wife's surveillance activities. Karen gasps dramatically and calls out to her husband, Dave, come look at this. That new woman is out there again, sunbathing by her pool. This is the third time this week. It's completely inappropriate for our neighborhood." Dave sighs without looking up from his paper. "Karen, people are allowed to use their own pools. Maybe you should find a hobby that doesn't involve spying on the neighbors." Karen ignores her husband's suggestion and continues her surveillance. She just moved in last month, and already she's disrupting the whole community's moral standards. I don't care what she does inside her house, but the backyard is visible from the street if you really look. Think about the children. Dave finally looks up, exasperated. "Karen, her yard has an 8-foot privacy fence. The only way anyone can see in is if they're using binoculars, like you are right now." Karen lowers her binoculars momentarily, looking offended. "I'm the HOA president. It's my responsibility to monitor compliance with community standards. Did you know she hasn't even submitted her paint color choices for approval yet? And I heard she works for the government. Probably some pencil pusher who thinks the rules don't apply to her." Karen marches up to the front door of her new neighbor's house, wearing her official HOA blazer with a homemade badge pinned to it. She raps sharply on the door and waits, tapping her foot impatiently. After a moment, the door opens to reveal Alexandra "Alex" Ramirez, 42, an athletic woman with an intelligent face who appears slightly annoyed at the interruption. Karen immediately launches into her prepared speech. "Hello, I'm Karen Winters, president of the Sunny Meadows Homeowners Association. I'm here because we've received complaints about inappropriate sunbathing activities in your backyard. According to Section 7, Paragraph 3 of our community guidelines, all recreational activities must be conducted with proper decorum and attire." Alex looks both confused and amused. "I'm sorry, what? I've been sunbathing in perfectly appropriate swimwear in my own fenced backyard. Who exactly is filing these complaints?" Karen straightens her posture. "The specific complainants are confidential, but rest assured, multiple residents have expressed concern." Alex leans against her doorframe, crossing her arms. "Let me get this straight. You're telling me I can't sunbathe in my own private backyard?" Karen nods emphatically. "Not in a manner that could be visible to neighbors or passersby. Perhaps you're unaware, but this is a family community with certain standards." Alex maintains her composure, but firmly responds, "I've read the HOA guidelines thoroughly before purchasing my home. There's nothing prohibiting sunbathing in appropriate attire in a private fenced yard. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to prepare for tomorrow." She politely closes the door, leaving Karen fuming on the doorstep. Karen is once again at her window with her binoculars, practically trembling with indignation. Dave enters the room carrying a cup of coffee. "Don't tell me you're still spying on the new neighbor." Karen doesn't even turn around. "She's deliberately provoking me, Dave. She's out there again. And I swear her swimsuit is even more revealing today. She's making a mockery of my authority." Dave sits down with a sigh. "Karen, please. This is getting obsessive. She's not doing anything wrong." Karen finally turns to face her husband, her expression determined. "If the HOA regulations aren't enough to stop this inappropriate behavior, then perhaps the law will be. I'm calling the police." Dave nearly spits out his coffee. "You're going to call the police because a woman is sunbathing in her own backyard? That's insane, Karen." Karen is already dialing on her phone. "It's public indecency, Dave. There are children in this neighborhood." Dave stands up. genuinely concerned now. "Karen, stop this right now. You're going to embarrass yourself and possibly get in trouble for filing a false report." Karen waves him off as she speaks into the phone. "Yes, hello. I'd like to report inappropriate and indecent behavior in our neighborhood. The new resident at 427 Maple Street is exposing herself in a way that's visible to the public, including children." "Yes, I'll hold." The summer heat bore down on the quiet suburban street as the white and blue police cruiser pulled up smoothly in front of 427 Maple Street. The vehicle's arrival immediately drew curious glances from neighbors who happened to be outside on this otherwise peaceful Saturday afternoon. Officer Jenkins, a seasoned 38-year-old patrol officer with salt and pepper hair visible beneath his cap, checked the address one more time against the dispatch notes. He'd been on the force for 15 years and had responded to his fair share of neighbor disputes, but calls about indecent exposure in someone's private backyard always raised red flags about the complainant's motives. Beside him, Officer Rodriguez, a 26-year-old rookie, just 6 months out of the academy, waited expectantly. Jenkins had been mentoring the younger officer and knew this call would provide a valuable lesson in community policing, though perhaps not in the way either of them anticipated. "Remember," Jenkins said quietly as they approached the immaculate walkway leading to the front door, "these neighbor complaints are almost always about something else. People don't call the cops because someone's sunbathing in their own yard, unless there's bad blood or an agenda." Rodriguez nodded, adjusting his collar in the heat. The house before them was a tasteful craftsman-style home, with fresh landscaping and subtle security features that Jenkins' trained eye immediately noticed: reinforced door frame, high-quality locks, and what appeared to be a discreet camera system integrated into the porch lighting. Not the typical setup for a troublemaker, he thought to himself. Whoever lived here valued privacy and security, not the profile of someone who would deliberately expose themselves inappropriately. Across the street, partially concealed behind a decorative shrub, but still painfully obvious to the officers, Karen Winters watched with undisguised anticipation. Her arms were crossed triumphantly across her chest, and a self-satisfied smile played at the corners of her mouth. Jenkins had encountered plenty of HOA presidents in his career and could spot the type from a mile away. Rodriguez followed his senior partner's gaze and grimaced slightly. "Is that our complainant?" he whispered. Jenkins nodded almost imperceptibly. "Textbook case. Let's just do this by the book." Officer Jenkins rapped his knuckles against the solid wood door, the sound echoing with professional authority. "Police department. Could we speak with the homeowner, please?" he called out, his voice carrying the practiced neutral tone that years on the force had perfected, neither accusatory nor dismissive, simply procedural. There was a brief pause, and both officers heard light footsteps approaching from inside. The door opened to reveal Alexandra Ramirez, an athletic woman in her early 40s with intelligent eyes that immediately assessed both officers with calm scrutiny. She was dressed in a casual t-shirt and shorts, clearly having thrown them on over what appeared to be the edges of a perfectly appropriate swimsuit. Her expression wasn't fearful or guilty, merely slightly annoyed at the interruption of her weekend. "I'm Alexandra Ramirez," she said, her voice measured and authoritative despite the casual setting. "What seems to be the problem, officers?" Jenkins immediately registered her composure and the subtle confidence that usually came with professional authority. This wasn't someone unused to dealing with law enforcement or uncomfortable with questioning. Officer Rodriguez, eager to handle this part of the interaction, stepped slightly forward and began to explain the situation. "Ma'am, we received a complaint about inappropriate exposure in a public setting," he began, but was politely yet firmly interrupted by Ms. Ramirez before he could complete his rehearsed statement. "In my private, fully fenced backyard?" she asked, one eyebrow raised slightly. There wasn't challenge in her voice, so much as a pointed clarification that immediately refocused the conversation. The question was posed with the precision of someone used to cutting to the heart of matters quickly. Jenkins recognized the technique. It was the same one he used when interviewing witnesses who were dancing around important details. Officer Jenkins nodded, the discomfort of the situation evident in his slight shift of posture. Yes, that's the nature of the complaint. We're required to follow up on all calls, regardless of their apparent merit. He was already mentally preparing to wrap this up quickly and have a serious word with the complainant across the street. Ms. Ramirez's backyard was surrounded by what appeared to be an 8-foot privacy fence. There was no way anyone could see into it without deliberate effort. Alexandra Ramirez sighed, the sound conveying not distress, but rather resignation at having her day interrupted by what was clearly a frivolous complaint. She reached toward her back pocket, the movement smooth and practiced. Both officers instinctively tensed slightly, a habit formed from years of training, but relaxed immediately as they saw her withdraw a slim wallet. "Officers, I understand you're doing your job. I'm actually Director Alexandra Ramirez with the FBI field office downtown. I'd appreciate if we could resolve this quickly as I have an early morning briefing with Homeland Security tomorrow." She held out her identification card, which featured the unmistakable FBI shield and credentials that both officers immediately recognized. The revelation landed like a thunderclap in the otherwise quiet suburban tableau. Officer Jenkins' eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he examined the credentials, which were genuine beyond any doubt. Director Ramirez, a name he now realized he'd heard mentioned in briefings and interagency communications, was the recently appointed head of the FBI field office that coordinated with their department on major cases. She had a reputation for efficiency and fairness that had already spread through local law enforcement circles. Jenkins suddenly understood the security features on the home and the professional demeanor that had struck him immediately. Officer Rodriguez, less able to hide his surprise, straightened his posture unconsciously. "Director Ramirez, we had no idea." His voice carried the stunned respect of a rookie suddenly realizing he was speaking to someone several pay grades above his chief. Jenkins silently appreciated how this encounter would become a story Rodriguez would tell for years to come. "No apology necessary," Alex replied with a genuine smile that softened her professional demeanor. Her voice took on a more conversational tone as she continued, "You're responding to a call as you should. But I assure you, I'm simply enjoying my weekend in the privacy of my own home, breaking no laws." There was no defensiveness in her explanation, just the matter-of-fact clarification of someone used to dealing with situations directly. She glanced past the officers toward Karen's poorly concealed surveillance position across the street, and a look of understanding crossed her face. "I believe my neighbor has been monitoring my activities with binoculars, which seems significantly more concerning from a privacy standpoint." The observation wasn't delivered as a complaint, but rather as a professional assessment of the situation. She didn't appear angry about Karen's behavior, merely noting the irony with the calm perspective of someone who dealt with surveillance issues professionally. Jenkins nodded, the entire situation now crystallizing in his mind. "Yes, ma'am. I believe we understand the situation completely now." His tone conveyed that he recognized exactly what was happening. An overzealous neighbor had called the police on an FBI director who was simply trying to enjoy her weekend. The absurdity wasn't lost on him, but his professionalism prevented him from expressing his thoughts on the matter too explicitly. Director Ramirez's home revealed subtle details about her character that both officers now noticed with greater attention. Family photos visible in the entryway showed her in professional settings alongside high-ranking government officials, and what appeared to be commendation plaques hung discreetly on one wall. A stack of case files sat on a side table near the door, likely work she'd brought home for the weekend. She lived alone from all appearances, her home organized with the efficiency of someone whose professional life demanded precision and attention to detail. "I appreciate your prompt response," she said, her tone genuine. "I understand you have to investigate all calls, even those that seem improbable." The slight pause before the last word carried volumes of meaning without being overtly critical of their presence. "I've only been in the neighborhood for a month, and I'm still getting to know everyone. Some adjustments are to be expected." The diplomatic phrasing suggested years of experience navigating sensitive interpersonal situations. Officer Jenkins cleared his throat, now fully aware that they were essentially wasting the time of someone who coordinated major federal investigations. "We'll address the situation with the complainant, Director. Thank you for your understanding." He glanced meaningfully at his partner, silently communicating that they would be having a serious conversation with Karen about the appropriate use of emergency services and potential harassment issues. "Thank you, officers," Director Ramirez replied with a nod. "I hope the rest of your shift is uneventful." The standard farewell carried a genuine quality that both men appreciated. Law enforcement professionals recognizing each other's roles despite the awkwardness of the situation. As they turned to leave, Officer Rodriguez couldn't help but ask a question that had clearly been forming since the revelation of her identity. "Director, if you don't mind me asking, the new task force on cybercrime that's being formed, is that under your jurisdiction?" Jenkins shot him a warning glance, but Director Ramirez smiled indulgently. "It is," she confirmed. "In fact, we're looking to establish better coordination with local departments. Have your surgeon contact my office next week. We could use officers with initiative." The subtle compliment wasn't lost on the young officer, whose face brightened considerably despite the awkward circumstances of their meeting. As they descended the front steps and headed back toward their cruiser, both officers squared their shoulders and set their expressions into the professional mask required for the next part of this call, confronting Karen Winters about wasting police resources and potentially harassing her neighbor. Across the street, Karen's triumphant expression had begun to falter as she observed the respectful interaction, and now saw the officers heading determinedly in her direction. Jenkins spoke quietly to his partner as they crossed the street. "Remember this moment, Rodriguez. This is why we always investigate before making assumptions." About to give someone a reality check they'll never forget. Rodriguez nodded, already composing in his mind how he would retell this story at the precinct later, the day they were called to arrest an FBI director for sunbathing in her own backyard, only to end up investigating the complainant instead. The summer heat seemed to intensify as Officers Jenkins and Rodriguez crossed the pristine asphalt of Maple Street, their boots making deliberate sounds against the pavement. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically in the last few minutes. What had begun as a routine call about a potentially inappropriate neighbor had transformed into something far more complex and delicate. Jenkins, with 15 years of experience handling community disputes, had never quite encountered a situation like this one. Beside him, Officer Rodriguez maintained his professional demeanor, though the slight tension in his jaw revealed his discomfort with the confrontation ahead. They were no longer responding to a complaint. They were addressing the complainant herself about potentially serious misconduct. Karen Winters stood her ground as the officers approached, though her previously triumphant posture had begun to falter. The binoculars she had been using were now hastily tucked into her large designer handbag, as if hiding the evidence of her surveillance activities. She wore her typical weekend attire, pressed khaki capers and a polo shirt embroidered with the Sunny Meadows Edoe logo, clothing that seemed designed to convey authority in a neighborhood setting. Her husband Dave had appeared in the doorway behind her, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and resignation, as if he had predicted this exact outcome, but had been powerless to prevent it. Several neighbors had emerged onto their porches or paused their yard work, sensing the unusual tension in the air and curious about why police officers were now approaching Karen rather than dealing with the alleged offender across the street. "Officers," Karen called out with forced cheerfulness as they drew near, "were you able to address the situation with that woman?" Her voice carried an expectant tone, as if she were a supervisor checking in on completed work. The slight emphasis on that woman revealed volumes about her attitude toward her new neighbor. She clutched her handbag tighter, unconsciously hiding the binoculars that had been her investigative tool. Behind her, Dave closed his eyes briefly, already sensing the direction this conversation would take. Officer Jenkins maintained his professional expression, though those who knew him well might have detected the slight tightening around his eyes that signaled his disapproval. "Ma'am, we need to speak with you about the complaint you filed," he began, his tone carefully neutral but firm. The deliberate formality of his address, not using her name despite her having identified herself during the initial call, subtly established the serious nature of the conversation. Officer Rodriguez took a half-step to the side, positioning himself to observe both Karen and the growing audience of neighbors while maintaining the appearance of a united front with his partner. Karen's smile faltered only momentarily before she recovered, still clinging to her assumption that the officers were about to validate her concerns. "Yes, officers. I'm glad you responded so quickly to my call. These types of inappropriate behaviors really can't be tolerated in a family neighborhood like ours." She gestured vaguely toward Director Ramirez's home, her movement suggesting ownership not just of her property but of the community standards she believed herself to be defending. The confidence in her voice suggested she had never considered that this interaction might not go her way. Officer Rodriguez, following his training for documentation during sensitive community interactions, took out his department-issued notepad with deliberate slowness. The action was both procedural and psychological, signaling to Karen that her words were now being officially recorded. "Ma'am, are you aware that filing a false police report is a criminal offense?" he asked, his voice carrying the precise cadence of an officer reciting potential charges. Before Karen could respond, he continued, "And that using optical devices to spy into someone's private property could potentially constitute stalking and invasion of privacy." The question hung in the air between them, transforming the dynamic from Karen as complainant to Karen as potential offender. The blood drained from Karen's face so quickly that for a moment, Officer Jenkins wondered if she might faint. Her mouth opened and closed without producing sound, resembling a fish suddenly finding itself out of water. The neighbors who had been watching from a distance inched closer, sensing the dramatic turn of events. Dave stepped forward from the doorway, moving to stand beside his wife in a gesture that was both supportive and restraining. "Officers, what exactly are you suggesting?" he asked, his voice low and concerned, already reaching for his wife's elbow as if to steady her. Karen recovered her voice, though it emerged higher and more strained than before. "I wasn't spying. I was monitoring compliance with HOA regulations." The defensive protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. Her hand instinctively tightened around her handbag, the outline of the binoculars visible through the expensive leather. "As HOA president, I have a responsibility to ensure that community standards are maintained. That's all I was doing." The tremble in her voice betrayed her growing realization that she had miscalculated badly. Officer Jenkins shook his head, his expression a careful balance of authority and restraint. "Ma'am." "Director Ramirez." "Yes, FBI Director Ramirez has the right to reasonable privacy in her fenced backyard. Your actions could potentially constitute harassment." He emphasized the word director with subtle but unmistakable significance, watching as the full impact of the revelation registered on Karen's face. The neighbors who overheard this exchange exchanged shocked glances and whispers, the information about their new neighbor's identity spreading quickly through the small gathering. Karen's mouth dropped open in genuine shock, her previously controlled demeanor crumbling entirely. "FBI Director. But I thought." Her voice trailed off as she struggled to assimilate this new information, mentally recalibrating everything she thought she knew about the woman she had been surveilling. The binoculars in her bag now felt like incriminating evidence rather than a tool of community oversight. She never mentioned, during the HOA welcome meeting, she just said she worked for the government, Karen stammered, as if this omission somehow justified her actions. Officer Rodriguez continued with his professional demeanor, though those paying close attention might have noticed the slight satisfaction in his eyes at witnessing justice unfold in real time. "We're issuing you a warning today, but if we receive any additional complaints about you monitoring or harassing Director Ramirez, there could be legal consequences." He flipped his notepad closed with a practiced movement, having documented the interaction. "The director has not pressed charges at this time, which speaks to her professionalism. and grace. The implied comparison between Karen's behavior and Director Ramirez's restraint hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. The gathered neighbors, previously sympathetic to Karen as the long-standing HOA president, now regarded her with expressions ranging from disapproval to barely concealed amusement. Several of them had experienced Karen's zealous enforcement of HOA regulations themselves over the years, and the reversal of fortune carried a certain poetic justice that wasn't lost on the small community. One neighbor, who had received a citation just last month for unapproved garden decorations, didn't even attempt to hide her satisfied smile. Dave, sensing both his wife's humiliation and the potential legal seriousness of the situation, stepped forward more prominently. "I tried to tell her to stop, officers. I promise this won't happen again." His voice carried the weary resignation of a man who had often found himself apologizing for his wife's excess of community enthusiasm. He gave Karen a pointed look that clearly communicated they would be having a serious conversation later, away from the public eye. Karen has been very dedicated to maintaining neighborhood standards, sometimes perhaps too dedicated, he added, attempting to salvage some dignity from the situation while acknowledging the overreach. Karen stood frozen in place, the reality of her situation slowly sinking in. She had called the police on the head of the local FBI field office, someone with significant law enforcement connections and authority that dwarfed her HOA presidency. The woman she had been surveilling and reporting wasn't a rule-breaking newcomer, but a high-ranking federal official who had likely been aware of Karen's activities all along and had shown remarkable restraint in her response. The realization that Director Ramirez could have taken much more serious action against her, but had chosen not to, began to dawn on Karen, adding embarrassment to her already considerable shock. From across the street, Alex stood in her doorway, watching the scene unfold with composed dignity. She made no attempt to approach or insert herself into the officer's conversation with Karen, but her presence served as a silent reminder of the power dynamic that had been invisibly at play all along. When Officer Jenkins glanced her way, she acknowledged him with a small professional nod before turning to go back inside her home. The gesture somehow underscored the absurdity of the situation more effectively than any words could have done. As the officers delivered their final warnings and prepared to depart, the neighborhood buzzed with the news that would undoubtedly dominate community discussions for weeks to come. Karen Winters, the self-appointed guardian of Sunny Meadows community standards, had called the police on the FBI director for sunbathing in her own private backyard. The irony was lost on no one, least of all Karen herself, who now stood in stunned silence as the officers returned to their vehicle, her carefully constructed authority in the neighborhood crumbling around her with each passing moment. "We'll be following up next week to ensure there are no further issues," Officer Jenkins said as a parting comment, his tone making it clear exactly which neighbor they would be checking in on. As the police cruiser pulled away from the curb, Karen remained rooted to the spot, her face flushed with humiliation as neighbors retreated to their homes, already reaching for their phones to spread the news throughout the community. The balance of power in Sunny Meadows had shifted dramatically in the space of a single afternoon, and nothing would be quite the same again. The Sunny Meadows Community Center had never seen such perfect attendance at an HOA meeting. The modest building's meeting room, typically populated by the same dozen or so dedicated or argumentative residents, was now filled to capacity. Extra chairs had been brought in from the adjacent yoga studio to accommodate the unprecedented turnout, and still some residents stood along the back wall, unwilling to miss what promised to be the most interesting HOA meeting in the community's 15-year history. The air conditioning struggled against the combined body heat, creating a subtle background hum that matched the excited murmurs circulating through the crowd. Every seat was filled except one, the president's chair at the head of the table, which remained conspicuously vacant as residents filed in and found their places. Karen Winters sat at the far end of the conference table, as far from her former position of authority as physically possible while still being present. Her rigid posture and carefully neutral expression betrayed nothing of her inner turmoil, though the slight tremor in her hand as she arranged and rearranged her meeting agenda gave some indication of her discomfort. Her typically immaculate appearance showed subtle signs of strain. Her blouse had a barely perceptible wrinkle, and her usually perfect French manicure had a small chip on the index finger. These minute details would have gone unnoticed on anyone else, but on Karen, they spoke volumes about the week she had endured. Beside her, Dave sat supportively, occasionally patting her hand in a gesture that seemed to both comfort and restrain her. The events of the previous weekend had spread through Sunny Meadows with the speed and efficiency that only suburban gossip networks can achieve. By Sunday evening, every household knew that Karen had called the police on the new resident, who turned out to be the director of the local FBI field office. By Monday morning, embellished versions of the story had reached the neighboring communities, complete with exaggerated details about Karen's surveillance activities and Director Ramirez's response. Tuesday brought an emergency board meeting where Karen, recognizing the inevitable, had voluntarily stepped down from her position as HOA president pending a review of her conduct. Wednesday saw a flurry of emails from the interim board announcing this special community meeting to address recent events and leadership transitions. Margaret Chen, a retired judge and longtime resident who had previously declined Karen's persistent recruitment attempts for HOA involvement, now sat in the acting president's chair. At 65, Margaret carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had presided over far more contentious proceedings than a homeowners association meeting. Her silver hair was cut in a practical bob, and her eyes, sharp behind stylish glasses, missed nothing as she observed the assembled residents. Unlike Karen's rule-by-intimidation approach, Margaret's leadership style drew from decades of judicial experience. Fair, methodical, and remarkably difficult to rattle. She tapped her gavel gently, bringing the murmuring crowd to attention with an efficiency Karen had never achieved despite years of increasingly loud gavel banging. "Thank you all for coming," Margaret began, her voice carrying the practiced clarity of someone accustomed to being heard in courtrooms. "I know we have a full agenda tonight, but before we address the administrative changes and policy reviews, I'd like to welcome our newest community member, who has graciously offered to help revise our outdated privacy guidelines. Please welcome Alexandra Ramirez." The announcement sent another wave of whispers through the room as all heads turned toward the door, anticipation hanging thick in the air. Karen's knuckles whitened around her pen, but she maintained her composed expression through what appeared to be considerable effort. Alexandra Ramirez entered the room with the confident ease of someone accustomed to high-pressure situations. She wore a business-casual outfit, tailored slacks, and a navy blazer over a simple blouse. Professional without being intimidating. The folder she carried contained what appeared to be meticulously prepared documents, reflecting the thoroughness that had propelled her career in federal law enforcement. Several residents applauded as she made her way to the front of the room, a gesture that would have been unusual at any previous HOA meeting. Karen sank slightly lower in her seat, the pen in her hand now at risk of snapping under the pressure of her grip. Dave placed his hand over hers, gently coaxing her to release the writing instrument before she damaged it or herself. Alex addressed the group with a warm smile that transformed her professional demeanor, making her immediately accessible to the room full of neighbors. "Thank you all for the welcome," she began, her voice carrying easily without seeming forceful. Despite an unusual introduction to the neighborhood, she glanced briefly in Karen's direction, the look neither accusatory nor mocking, simply acknowledging the elephant in the room. "I'm looking forward to contributing to this community. In my line of work, I understand the importance of both security and personal freedoms. I've drafted some suggested updates to our community guidelines that protect everyone's privacy while maintaining the neighborhood standards we all appreciate." The proposed guidelines Alex distributed were remarkable in their clarity and fairness. Protection against invasive surveillance balanced with reasonable community oversight, all written in straightforward language that contrasted sharply with the convoluted legalese of Karen's previous HOA documents. Residents flipped through the pages with obvious approval, several nodding at particularly sensible provisions. Margaret reviewed her copy with the practiced eye of a former judge, nodding appreciatively at the legal soundness of the document. "These are excellent recommendations, Director Ramirez. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us," she said, using Alex's professional title with genuine respect, rather than the intimidation tactic Karen had often employed with residents' job titles. Karen sat motionless as the documents made their way around the table, her copy remaining untouched before her. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present. The very neighbor she had attempted to police was now rewriting the community guidelines, with an authority and expertise Karen couldn't hope to match. Several residents who had previously been on the receiving end of Karen's zealous enforcement now watched her discomfort with barely concealed satisfaction. The community's power dynamics had shifted dramatically in the span of a week, and the resulting redistribution left Karen effectively powerless in the organization she had dominated for years. As the meeting progressed through agenda items, Karen remained uncharacteristically silent. The financial report, landscaping updates, and upcoming community events, all topics on which she would typically have offered extensive commentary, passed without a single interjection from her. Dave occasionally whispered encouraging words, but Karen seemed suspended in a state between humiliation and reflection, processing the complete reversal of her community standing. Across the room, neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact with her for fear of being cited for some minor infraction now spoke freely, offering ideas and opinions that would have been immediately dismissed under Karen's leadership. The meeting concluded with a unanimous vote to adopt Director Ramirez's privacy guidelines effective immediately, with additional recommendations to be considered at the next regular meeting. As residents gathered their belongings and broke into smaller conversation groups, many made a point of introducing themselves to Alex, offering belated welcomes and invitations to various community events. The genuine warmth of these interactions contrasted sharply with the perfunctory welcomes new residents typically received, indicating that Alex had already earned a respect that Karen had spent years pursuing but never achieved. Throughout it all, Alex maintained a genuine but professional demeanor, neither leveraging her position for special treatment nor downplaying her authority. As the crowd thinned, Dave leaned close to Karen's ear, his voice gentle but insistent. "This would be a good time to speak with her," he suggested, nodding toward Alex, who was gathering her materials at the front of the room. "You've been practicing your apology all week." Karen's eyes widened in momentary panic before she squared her shoulders and gave a curt nod. The journey from her seat at the back of the room to where Alex stood seemed to take both forever and no time at all, each step requiring Karen to set aside layers of pride that had defined her community identity for years. "Director Ramirez," Karen began, her voice softer than anyone in the community had ever heard it, "I owe you an apology. I was out of line with my actions." The words came out stiffly but sincerely, clearly rehearsed, but no less meaningful for the preparation. She stood rigidly, hands clasped before her, looking less like the intimidating HOA president and more like a chastened neighbor facing the consequences of her overreach. Dave stood a respectful distance away, giving his wife space to make her amends while remaining supportive through his presence. Alex set down her folder and turned to face Karen fully, giving her complete attention in a way that acknowledged the difficulty and importance of the moment. "We all want to protect our community, Mrs. Winters," she responded graciously, neither dismissing Karen's apology nor dwelling on her transgression. "The difference is in how we go about it. Perhaps we could start fresh." The offer came without condescension, a genuine opportunity to reset their neighbor relationship on more equal and respectful terms. Alex extended her hand, a simple gesture that carried significant weight in the context of their previous interactions. Karen hesitated only briefly before accepting the handshake, relief visibly washing over her features as she realized the extent of Alexandra's grace in handling the situation. "I'd like that," she replied, her voice steadier now. "And I have some institutional knowledge about the community that might be helpful as you revise the guidelines." The offer represented a significant shift for Karen, from dictating rules to collaborating on them, from enforcing standards to contributing experience. It was a small step toward redemption, but an important one. Margaret observed the exchange with quiet approval, recognizing the beginning of what could be a valuable transformation in community dynamics. I think we could all benefit from combining Director Ramirez's professional expertise with Mrs. Winter's community experience, she suggested, creating space for Karen to contribute positively while maintaining the new, more balanced power structure. Several nearby residents nodded in agreement, willing to accept Karen's involvement as long as it remained collaborative rather than authoritarian. As the last few residents departed, the community center fell into an unusual quiet. The meeting had represented more than just a change in HOA leadership or privacy guidelines. It had demonstrated the community's capacity for growth and adaptation. Karen and Dave walked toward their home in thoughtful silence, both processing the events of the evening. Across the street, Alexandra Ramirez let herself into her house, satisfied with her contribution to neighborhood harmony. The privacy fence around her backyard stood as it always had, a boundary that protected her right to enjoy her property while respecting the community around her. The perfect metaphor for the balance she had helped restore to Sunny Meadows. In the weeks that followed, residents noticed subtle changes in the neighborhood atmosphere. HOA violation notices decreased dramatically, replaced by collaborative community improvement initiatives. Karen, though no longer in a leadership position, channeled her organizational skills into the community garden project, finding surprising satisfaction in building something rather than policing others. Alexandra became a respected but unobtrusive presence in community matters, offering expertise when needed but never overstepping. And on particularly sunny weekends, if anyone happened to notice Director Ramirez enjoying her private backyard pool, they respectfully turned their attention elsewhere, having learned a valuable lesson about assumptions, privacy, and respect.